There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that retrospectively become the load-bearing walls of your entire emotional architecture. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in quietly on a Tuesday night, smelling of stale pizza and the clean, sharp scent of impending rain. For me, that moment was the precise weight of Julian's head in my lap. It was a pressure both infinitesimal and absolute, a single point of contact that seemed to anchor the entire spinning world. He was asleep, lost to the deep, untroubled currents that I could only ever watch from the shore. His breathing was a soft, rhythmic tide against the silence of our third-floor apartment, a sound so familiar it had become part of the ambient noise of my life, like the hum of the refrigerator or the distant moan of city traffic. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, every exhale felt like a confession, a wordless syllable I was desperate to translate. He'd collapsed onto the couch an hour ago, mid-sentence, talking about some ridiculously complex coding problem that had been plaguing him at his internship. His voice, usually a confident baritone that could cut through the roar of a stadium, had frayed at the edges, thinned by exhaustion. He'd trailed off, his words melting into a sigh, and then his head had listed, slowly, inevitably, until it came to rest against my thigh. I had frozen, my entire body locking into a state of suspended animation. My own breath caught in my throat, a traitorous bird beating its wings against my ribs. I was a wildlife photographer who had stumbled upon a creature of myth, terrified that the slightest twitch, the click of a shutter, would shatter the spell and send it fleeing back into the shadowed forest of our friendship. My hand hovered in the air above his hair, a pale ghost in the low light of the reading lamp. I wanted, with an ache that was almost physical, to touch him, to smooth down the dark strands that had fallen across his forehead, to feel the warmth of his scalp, to offer a comfort that went beyond the silent, sturdy presence I had always provided. But I didn't. I never did. My role was that of the observer, the silent witness to the constellation of his life, and I had learned long ago not to disturb the heavens. The architecture of our friendship had been designed with such careful precision. It was a sturdy, reliable structure built on a foundation of late-night study sessions, shared victories on the soccer field, and the easy camaraderie of two people who understood each other's silences. We were roommates, teammates, best friends. The lines were drawn in clear, indelible ink. He was Julian, the sun-drenched center of every room, the star striker with a smile that could disarm armies. And I was Leo, the quiet one, the keeper of the net and, later, the keeper of the camera, content to live in his orbit, capturing the light he cast off so effortlessly. But for years, a secret blueprint had existed beneath the sanctioned one, a hidden schematic in my own heart detailing rooms we never entered, doors we never opened. And in this moment, with the solid, trusting weight of him pinning me to the worn fabric of the couch, I felt the floorboards of our carefully constructed friendship begin to creak. A tremor was running through the foundation, and I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, the whole thing would come crashing down around us, burying us both in the rubble of everything I had been too cowardly to say. So I sat there, a statue carved from fear and longing, and listened to him breathe, praying for a dawn that I hoped would never come. We met, as so many friendships at our university were forged, in the crucible of autumn athletics. It was the first day of freshman tryouts for the soccer team, a humid afternoon in late August where the air was thick with the smell of cut grass and nervous sweat. I saw him before I heard him. He was a shock of kinetic energy against the languid green of the field, all sharp angles and fluid motion. Even in the warm-ups, there was an incandescent confidence to him, a certainty in the way his cleats met the ball that seemed to broadcast his intentions to the entire world. He moved like he belonged everywhere, like every space was built specifically for him to occupy. Then I heard his laugh, a loud, unself-conscious bark of a sound that cut through the low murmur of the other hopefuls. He was joking with a couple of upperclassmen, clapping one on the back, and they were laughing with him, drawn into his gravitational pull. I, on the other hand, was doing my best to become invisible, a common practice of mine. I was a goalkeeper, a position that suited my temperament, solitary, watchful, a final line of defense. My job was to observe, to anticipate, to react, not to initiate. I stood at the edge of the group, stretching my hamstrings, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Our first real interaction was a collision. It was during a scrimmage, the sun beating down on the back of my neck. A forward from the opposing side broke through the defensive line, a clear shot on goal. I came out to meet him, narrowing the angle, my body tense for the impact. But from the corner of my eye, I saw a blur of motion. It was Julian, sprinting back with an impossible, lung-burning speed. He slid, a perfectly timed tackle that sent the ball skittering away and the forward tumbling to the grass. The momentum carried him forward, and he crashed directly into me. We went down in a tangle of limbs, the air knocked from my lungs in a sharp gasp. For a moment, all I could process was the surprising solidity of him, the heat of his body pressed against mine, the scent of grass and sweat, and something uniquely, cleanly him. He scrambled off me immediately, his face a mask of concern. "Leo, right? Man, I am so sorry. You good?" His hand was on my arm, his touch firm and steady. His eyes, a shade of brown so dark they were almost black, were fixed on mine, searching for any sign of injury. I just nodded, still trying to reclaim my breath. "I'm fine," I managed to rasp. He grinned, and the anxiety in his expression was replaced by that brilliant, disarming smile. That was some solid positioning. "You came out like a bolt of lightning." He offered me a hand up, and his grip was strong, pulling me to my feet as if I weighed nothing. That was the beginning. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated teamwork, a shared physical goal that somehow laid the first stone of our friendship. We both made the team, of course. Him as the starting striker, me as the backup keeper. We fell into an easy rhythm. Our lives began to orbit the shared sun of the team. Early morning practices, grueling conditioning sessions, long bus rides to away games, and the communal highs and lows of wins and losses. We ended up in the same introductory literature class, a happy accident that solidified our bond outside the chalk lines of the field. We discovered a shared, nerdy appreciation for dense fantasy novels and a mutual disdain for our professor's interpretation of modernist poetry. We started studying together in the library, our hushed whispers about iambic pentameter often devolving into silent, shaking laughter that earned us glares from nearby students. He was smarter than his jock persona let on, with a quick, inquisitive mind that loved to dismantle problems, whether it was a defensive formation or a line of convoluted prose. I learned the cartography of his moods, the way his jaw would tighten when he was frustrated, the small, almost imperceptible dip at the corner of his mouth when he was genuinely moved by something, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about his family back home. By sophomore year, it was a foregone conclusion that we would get an apartment together. His previous roommate was a slob, and mine was a ghost who only materialized to leave passive-aggressive notes about the recycling. Moving in together felt less like a decision and more like a natural, inevitable progression, like a river finding its course to the sea. Our apartment became a sanctuary, a space that was entirely our own, away from the pressures of school and the team. It was a typical college dump, with mismatched furniture and a persistent draft from the living room window, but we made it a home. We developed a domestic shorthand, a silent dance of cohabitation. I knew he liked his coffee with too much sugar, and he knew I couldn't sleep if there were dirty dishes in the sink. He would leave his damp towels on the floor, and I would pick them up without comment. I would forget to buy milk, and he would come home with 2 cartons, just in case. It was a simple, comfortable ecosystem, and for a long time, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The realization, when it came, was not a sudden lightning strike. It was more like the slow development of a photograph in a darkroom. I had been submerged in the chemical bath of our friendship for so long that I hadn't noticed the image emerging, faint at first, then gaining clarity and contrast until it was undeniable. The moment the picture fully resolved was after the conference championship game our junior year. We had won in a brutal, nail-biting penalty shootout. Julian had scored the winning kick. The moment the ball hit the back of the net, the stadium exploded. The team swarmed him, a tidal wave of blue and white jerseys, lifting him onto their shoulders. I was on the sidelines, having been benched with a minor wrist injury a few weeks prior, my season effectively over. I had transitioned into my new role as the unofficial team photographer, documenting our journey with the old film camera my grandfather had given me. I watched the celebration through my viewfinder, a sea of ecstatic faces, and I zoomed in on Julian. He was at the center of it all, his head thrown back, his face split by a grin of pure, unadulterated joy, his arms raised in triumph. He looked like a triumphant god, bathed in the harsh glare of the stadium lights. And as I pressed the shutter, capturing the image on a frame of silver halide, a feeling washed over me that was so powerful, so profound, it almost buckled my knees. It was not just pride. It was not just friendship. It was a deep, resonant ache of love, so pure and so hopeless it felt like a kind of sacred sorrow. From that day forward, everything was different, yet nothing had changed. The surface of our lives remained placid, but beneath it, a powerful undertow had begun to pull at me. I was hyper-aware of him in a way that was both exquisite and torturous. I noticed the small things, the way he would absent-mindedly chew on his thumbnail when he was concentrating, the constellation of freckles across the bridge of his nose that only appeared in the summer, the exact timbre of his voice when he was tired. My camera became both my shield and my confessional. Through its lens, I could stare at him unabashedly. I could document the grace in his movements, the honesty in his unguarded expressions. I had albums full of him. Julian midair, heading a ball. Julian laughing with teammates on the bus. Julian asleep on our couch, a textbook open on his chest. It was my way of holding on to him, of possessing a part of him that was just for me. Each photograph was a silent, unsendable love letter. And then there was Sarah. She had been a constant presence in his life since the end of freshman year. She was beautiful, intelligent, and kind, the sort of person it was impossible to dislike, which only made it worse. They were the golden couple, effortlessly perfect together. I watched them from the periphery, a ghost at their feast. I learned to perfect a mask of cheerful indifference. I listened to him talk about her, offered advice when he asked for it, and smiled through the pang of jealousy that felt like swallowing broken glass. I compartmentalized my feelings, locking them away in a dark, soundproof room in the back of my mind. I told myself that my love for him was a quiet, monastic thing, a feeling that asked for nothing in return except the privilege of proximity. I convinced myself that our friendship was the most important thing, a structure too precious to risk for the sake of a selfish and impossible desire. The foundation was solid, I told myself. The walls were strong. As long as I never tested the locks on those hidden doors, everything would be fine. I was a masterful architect of my own denial. The demolition began on a rainy Thursday in October of our senior year. I came home from a late class to find the apartment door slightly ajar. A cold, damp wind was whispering its way into the hallway, and I felt an immediate prickle of unease. I pushed the door open and found Julian standing in the middle of the living room, completely still, surrounded by the wreckage of his relationship. A cardboard box sat at his feet, filled with the artifacts of his 2 years with Sarah, a framed photo, a couple of her sweatshirts, a stack of books, a worn teddy bear. He was holding his phone in one hand, staring at a blank screen. His face was pale, his expression hollowed out. The usual light in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind a flat, dull emptiness. He looked up as I came in, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something raw and desperate in his gaze before it was shuttered away. "She's gone," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, stripped of all its usual warmth. "She came by while I was in class. Took her stuff. Left this," he nudged the box with his foot. It was the finality of it that seemed to have broken him. Not a fight, not a tearful goodbye, but a silent, surgical removal of her presence from his life. I didn't know what to say. The usual platitudes felt like cheap, flimsy things in the face of his grief. So I said nothing. I just walked over, took the phone from his unresisting hand, and set it on the kitchen counter. I closed the front door, shutting out the melancholy evening, and then I stood beside him, sharing the heavy silence. He didn't cry. He just stood there, a statue of loss, and I stood with him, a silent sentinel. After a long time, he finally moved, his shoulders slumping in a gesture of utter defeat. I don't want to be alone right now, Leo, he whispered, and the sound was so fragile it nearly broke my heart. You're not, I said, my own voice quiet but firm. I'm right here. That night marked the shift. It was the moment the carefully drawn blueprints of our friendship were discarded. The external crisis had created an internal need, a vacuum of comfort that he, consciously or not, began to pull me into. The lines blurred, the boundaries dissolved, and the quiet, platonic space between us began to shrink, slowly and irrevocably. It started with a simple migration. For years, our apartment had a clear nocturnal geography. My room was my sanctuary, a dark cave filled with the scent of photochemicals and old books. His was his own space, usually a controlled chaos of clothes and textbooks. We were separated by a short hallway, a buffer zone that respected the unspoken rules of privacy. But after the breakup, that geography began to warp. Julian couldn't settle. I would hear him pacing in his room late at night, the floorboards groaning under his restless weight. I'd see the light under his door click on and off at odd hours. He was adrift in his own grief, and his room had become a lonely, haunted island. The first time he abandoned it, it was almost 3 in the morning. I was at my desk in the corner of the living room, editing a set of photos from our last game, lost in the quiet meditation of adjusting light and shadow. The soft click of his bedroom door opening startled me. He appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of the hall, looking lost and much younger than his 21 years. He was wearing an old, faded t-shirt and a pair of plaid pajama pants, his hair a mess from tossing and turning. "Can't sleep," he mumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion. He didn't ask for anything, didn't offer any further explanation. He just drifted into the living room and folded his long frame onto the couch, pulling one of the throw blankets over himself. He lay on his side, facing the back of the sofa, a silent, wounded animal seeking refuge. I didn't say anything. I just turned back to my computer, the rhythmic click of my mouse the only sound in the room. But my focus was gone. My awareness was entirely consumed by his presence, just a few feet away. I could feel the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the air now charged with his silent pain. I stayed at my desk until the first pale fingers of dawn began to stretch across the sky, long after his breathing had deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. I felt like a night watchman, guarding over his fragile peace. When I finally got up, stiff and sore, I walked over and gently draped a second blanket over his shoulders before retreating to my own room. This became the new pattern, a silent, nightly ritual. He would try to sleep in his own bed, but sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the night, he would emerge and resettle on the couch. He never made a sound, never tried to wake me if I was already asleep in my room. I would just find him there in the morning, curled up under a pile of blankets, his face peaceful in a way it never was during the day. It was a strange, unspoken arrangement. We never talked about it. To acknowledge it would be to give it a weight and significance that I think we were both afraid to confront. For him, I suspect, it was a matter of plausible deniability. He wasn't asking for comfort. He was just a guy who couldn't sleep in his own bed. But for me, it was a profound intimacy. Sharing the quiet, vulnerable hours of the night with him, even from a distance, felt like being entrusted with a secret. The living room, once a shared, neutral territory, became a liminal space, a place where the boundaries between us were porous and undefined. The distance began to close, inch by painstaking inch. One night, a few weeks into this new routine, a thunderstorm rolled in, a violent, percussive assault of rain and wind against our old, rattling windows. The power flickered and died, plunging the apartment into a sudden, disorienting darkness. I was in my room, But the sound of a particularly loud clap of thunder was followed by a soft knock on my door. Leo. Julian's voice was small, tentative. I opened the door to find him standing there, his phone in his hand, its flashlight beam illuminating his anxious face. "Hey," he said, trying for a casual tone and failing. "This storm is something else, huh?" I nodded, my heart doing a slow, heavy drum roll in my chest. "You okay?" He shrugged, a gesture that was meant to be nonchalant, but was betrayed by the tension in his shoulders. "Yeah, just not a fan of the dark, you know." It was a ridiculous statement coming from a 6'2" athlete who could face down a charging defender without flinching, and we both knew it. It was a pretext, a fragile excuse for a deeper need. "Come on," I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. He hesitated for a moment, and in that pause, an entire universe of unspoken questions and possibilities hung in the air. Then he stepped over the threshold, and it felt like a monumental crossing, a breach of a long-respected border. He didn't get into my bed. He just sat on the floor, his back against the edge of the mattress, and I sat down beside him. We didn't talk. We just listened to the storm rage outside, two solitary figures huddled together in the dark, finding a strange comfort in our shared silence. After a while, his head slumped sideways, coming to rest on my shoulder. It was the first time he had initiated contact like that, a deliberate, conscious act. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth that spread through my entire body. I held my breath, terrified of scaring him off, but he just settled in, his breathing evening out. We sat like that for over an hour, until the storm passed, and the power hummed back to life. And in the sudden return of light, we both pretended that nothing significant had happened at all. From that night on, the ritual evolved. The couch was no longer enough. He would wait until he thought I was asleep, and I would feel the dip of the mattress as he slid into my bed. The first time, he stayed rigidly on the far edge, a country of cold sheets between us, his back a stiff, unyielding wall. I lay there, feigning sleep, my body screaming with a mixture of terror and elation. I was a cartographer discovering a new, uncharted continent in the dark. Slowly, night after night, the distance between us shrank. It was a glacial movement, almost imperceptible. He would shift in his sleep, an arm flung out that would brush against my back, a leg that would tangle with mine. Each accidental touch was a spark in the darkness, a message in a language I was desperately trying to learn. I became a scholar of his nocturnal movements, an expert in the subtle grammar of his sleeping body. I knew he was not truly asleep for all of it. Sometimes, I could feel the carefully controlled tension in his muscles before he would accidentally roll over, his forehead coming to rest in the space between my shoulder blades. It was a dance of denial, a masterpiece of unspoken need, and I was his willing, silent partner. The culmination of this slow, creeping intimacy was the night it all started, the night he fell asleep with his head in my lap. It was no longer about him seeking refuge from his own empty room. It was about him seeking my presence. We had been watching some mindless action movie, the volume low. He had started on the other end of the couch, but over the course of 2 hours, he had drifted closer, a satellite slowly being pulled into a planet's orbit. The final move was a simple, fluid motion. He just laid his head down, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I let him. I let him because I was a man dying of thirst, and he was offering me a single drop of water. It was a dangerous, addictive comfort. I was living in the ambiguous space he had created, a twilight world between friendship and something more. It was a beautiful, agonizing purgatory. I knew it couldn't last. This delicate ecosystem we had built was unsustainable. The tension was a high-strung wire, and sooner or later, one of us was going to pluck it. I just prayed that when it finally snapped, it wouldn't be the thing that severed us completely. The wire snapped on a quiet Wednesday night, 2 months after the storm. The ritual had become so ingrained in our lives that it no longer felt strange. It was simply the way our days ended. We were on the couch, side by side, the pale, flickering light of the television washing over us. The movie was one we'd both seen a dozen times, its dialogue a familiar, comforting murmur in the background. He was closer than usual, our shoulders and hips pressed together, the warmth of his body seeping into mine. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the movie, the hum of the city outside, and the soft rhythm of our breathing, which had somehow fallen into sync. The air in the room felt different. It had grown heavy, thick with all the words we had swallowed, all the gestures we had left unfinished. The plausible deniability that had been our shield for weeks was dissolving like mist in the morning sun. He shifted, turning his body to face me. The movement was deliberate, and it broke the spell of our shared inertia. He propped himself up on one elbow, his face just inches from mine. The television cast shifting patterns of light and shadow across his features, making his expression unreadable. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. This was it. This was the moment the ground would either solidify beneath my feet or crumble away entirely. He just looked at me, his dark eyes searching mine, and in their depths, I saw a maelstrom of emotions I couldn't begin to name. Confusion, fear, and something else, something softer and more vulnerable that made my breath catch. The silence stretched, taut and shimmering, a string pulled to its breaking point. I could feel his breath on my cheek, warm and uncertain. I waited, my entire being focused on that small, charged space between us. Leo. His voice was a whisper, a rough, fragile sound that was instantly swallowed by the quiet of the room. It was barely a word, but it held the weight of 1,000 conversations we'd never had. Yeah. I managed to breathe out, my own voice sounding distant and unsteady to my ears. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just kept looking at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. I could see the subtle pulse beating in his throat. He was just as terrified as I was. Then, he swallowed, a small, audible sound. "Can I ask you something weird?" A hysterical laugh almost bubbled up inside me. Weird? We had been living in a state of profound weirdness for months. We had built a home in the heart of weird. Always, I whispered, the single word a promise, an invitation, a surrender. He took a slow, shaky breath, as if steeling himself for a plunge into icy water. His eyes never left mine. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The question hung in the air between us, a delicate, crystalline thing. It was not a proposition, not a move. It was a plea for permission, an act of profound vulnerability. He was giving me all the power, offering me the choice to preserve the comfortable fiction of our friendship or to step with him into this terrifying, uncharted territory. In that moment, all my carefully constructed walls, all my years of self-protective silence, crumbled to dust. The quiet, monastic love I had nurtured in secret was no longer enough. I wanted the reality, whatever the cost. I couldn't find the words to answer him. My voice was gone, lost somewhere in the roaring rush of blood in my ears. So I just gave a single, slow nod. That was all the confirmation he needed. He leaned in, closing the final, infinitesimal distance between us. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like I had ever imagined. There was no fire, no desperate passion. It was a question, a moment of tentative, reverent discovery. His lips were soft, hesitant, and they tasted faintly of the mint tea he'd been drinking earlier. It was a kiss of breathtaking gentleness, a quiet confession whispered in the dark. One of his hands came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my skin, and the simple, grounding touch sent a tremor through me. I brought my own hand up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, wild beating of his heart beneath my palm. It was hammering just as hard as mine. The kiss lasted for only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. It was the breaking of a fever, the lancing of a wound, the end of a long, lonely exile. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We stayed like that, just breathing each other's air, the movie forgotten, the world outside silenced. In the beautiful, honest quiet that followed, I felt the last piece of the old architecture fall away, leaving us standing in the open air, with nothing left to hide behind. The dawn came, as it always does, indifferent to the seismic shifts that happen in the dark. I woke up first, a rare occurrence. Julian was still asleep, his head on my shoulder, his arm draped loosely across my chest. The morning light filtering through the blinds painted stripes across his face, and in the peaceful repose of sleep, he looked younger, the worry lines around his eyes smoothed away. For a few blissful, hazy moments, I let myself believe that everything had changed for the better. The memory of the kiss was a warm, glowing ember in my chest. It felt real, solid, a new foundation upon which we could build. I lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, trying to memorize the feeling of his weight against me, the sound of his soft breathing, the simple, profound fact of his closeness. It was a peace I had never known, a quiet, settled feeling that I mistook for a destination. When he finally stirred, the shift was immediate and brutal. His eyes fluttered open, and for a split second, they were soft with sleep. Then, they focused on me, and awareness crashed down. A shutter slammed shut behind his gaze, the vulnerability of the previous night vanishing completely. He pulled away as if he'd been burned, scrambling to sit up, putting a sudden, cold chasm of space between us on the couch. He wouldn't look at me. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, his jaw tight. I should get in the shower, he mumbled, his voice rough and distant. He was already on his feet, moving towards his room before I could even form a response. The warmth of his body lingered on my shirt for a moment before the cold morning air washed it away. I sat there on the couch, the echo of his touch still tingling on my skin, and a cold, heavy dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach. The beautiful, honest silence of the night had been replaced by a morning filled with a new, terrible kind of quiet. It was the silence of regret. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. Julian became a ghost in our own apartment. He was up and out before I woke up, and he came home late, long after I had retreated to my room. The couch, our sanctuary, our confessional, went unused. The nightly ritual was shattered. When our paths did cross in the hallway or the kitchen, the encounters were brief and excruciatingly awkward. He would offer a tight, forced smile that didn't reach his eyes, ask a perfunctory question about my day, and then find an excuse to disappear. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, on the ceiling, on anything but my face. It was like he couldn't bear to look at me, as if seeing me would force him to acknowledge what had happened between us. Every aborted conversation, every averted glance, was a small, sharp paper cut on my already raw heart. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the darkness of that Wednesday night began to wilt and turn to ash. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it from every angle, searching for the moment I had misread everything. Had I imagined the tenderness, the vulnerability in his question? Had it all been a lie, a moment of weakness brought on by loneliness and grief? Was I just a convenient, warm body for him, a placeholder for the comfort he had lost? The thought was a corrosive acid, eating away at my confidence, leaving me hollowed out with shame and hurt. I felt like a fool, an idiot who had mistaken a fleeting moment of confusion for a genuine connection. I had allowed myself to hope, and the universe was now punishing me for my audacity. The silence in the apartment grew louder each day, a roaring, oppressive presence that filled every room. It was the sound of our friendship breaking, the slow, agonizing creak of a support beam giving way. I knew, with a certainty that made me sick, that I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let us be destroyed by the unspoken. I had spent years living in silence, and I was done. I found my courage on a Sunday evening. I heard him come in, the soft click of the front door, the rustle of him dropping his gym bag. I took a deep breath, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm against my ribs, and walked out of my room. He was in the kitchen, his back to me, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. He stiffened when he heard my footsteps, his shoulders tensing up. He didn't turn around. "Hey," he said to the inside of the refrigerator door. "We need to talk, Jules," I said, my voice calmer and steadier than I felt. He closed the fridge slowly and leaned against it, finally turning to face me. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a spot on the floor just to the left of my feet. "There's nothing to talk about, Leo," he said, his tone flat, dismissive. "I was a mess that night. I'd been drinking. It was a mistake. Let's just forget it happened. Each word was a hammer blow. A mistake. The word echoed in the space between us, cruel and sharp. All the hurt and frustration of the past few days coalesced into a single point of painful clarity. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. Was it? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Was it a mistake? Or are you just scared? That made him look up. His eyes finally met mine, and I saw a flash of anger in them. But beneath it, there was a flicker of something else. Fear. I had been right. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, his voice defensive. It was nothing to me, I said, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. I spent years telling myself that what I felt for you was nothing, that it was something I had to hide, something I had to lock away so I wouldn't ruin this. Our friendship. I spent years being the quiet observer, the safe guy you could count on. And for 1 second, on that couch, I thought maybe I wasn't the only one who felt something more. My voice broke on the last few words, the confession hanging in the air, raw and exposed. But if it was just a mistake, if it was nothing, then you need to look me in the eye and tell me that. Tell me it was nothing to you. He stared at me, his face a battleground of conflicting emotions. The anger drained away, replaced by a look of profound, gut-wrenching turmoil. His carefully constructed walls were crumbling, and the person underneath was terrified. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He shook his head, a gesture of helpless frustration. I can't, he finally whispered, his voice cracking. I can't. He sank down onto one of the kitchen chairs, burying his face in his hands. I'm so scared, Leo, he said, his voice muffled by his palms. I don't know what this is. All I know is that when I'm with you, especially these last few months, it's the only time I feel safe. The only time the noise in my head stops. And that kiss, it wasn't a mistake. It was the most real thing I've felt in years. And that's what terrifies me. It felt too real. I thought if I just ignored it, it would go away, and we could go back to how we were. But it's not going away. He looked up at me then, his eyes shining with unshed tears, his expression one of complete, utter surrender. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was just so scared of breaking the best thing in my life. The confession, when it came, was not a triumphant victory. It was a quiet, messy, and profoundly human moment. Seeing him so broken, so stripped of his usual confidence, erased any lingering anger I had felt. All that was left was a deep, aching tenderness. I walked over and knelt in front of his chair, so we were at eye level. You didn't break it, I said softly. But you can't build something new if you're afraid to lay the first stone. We can't go back to how we were, Jules. That house is gone. But we can build something different. Something better. If we're both willing to try. He looked at me, a dawning hope in his eyes that mirrored my own. He reached out, his hand hesitant at first, and then he cupped the back of my neck, his thumb stroking my skin, a mirror of his gesture on the night of the kiss. Okay, he breathed, a single word that felt like a vow. Okay. That conversation was not a magic fix. It was the beginning of a long, slow process of excavation and reconstruction. We started talking, really talking, for the first time. We spent hours unraveling the tangled threads of our fears and assumptions. He told me about the rigid expectations he'd always felt, the narrow path he thought his life was supposed to follow. He admitted that his relationship with Sarah had been comfortable but had lacked the profound, quiet understanding he had with me. He was confronting a part of himself he never knew existed, and it was disorienting for him. I, in turn, confessed the depth and duration of my feelings, the years I had spent loving him in silence. I showed him the photographs, my secret archive of affection, and as he looked through them, his expression softened with a dawning understanding of just how long I had seen him, truly seen him. There were awkward moments, hesitant steps forward and fearful steps back. But we were finally moving in the same direction, guided by a new, shared honesty. The couch ritual returned, but it was transformed. There was no more pretense, no more plausible deniability. It was intentional. We would sit together in the evenings, and he would deliberately lean against me, or I would rest my head on his shoulder. The touch was no longer a question, but an answer. One evening, as we were sitting in comfortable silence, he reached over and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. He didn't say anything, just held on, his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles over my knuckles. It was a simple, grounding gesture, a quiet declaration that we were in this together. The ambiguity that had been a source of so much anxiety was replaced by a gentle, growing certainty. We were learning a new language, one spoken not in grand declarations, but in small, consistent acts of care and affection. We were building our new home, not with a sudden rush of construction, but brick by careful brick, creating a space that was strong enough to hold the truth of what we were to each other. The final wall of the old structure came down a few weeks later. I was woken in the middle of the night not by a sound, but by a presence. I opened my eyes to see Julian standing in the doorway of my bedroom. He wasn't coming from the couch. He was just standing there, looking at me. "I can't sleep," he said. The words a familiar refrain, but the tone was different. It wasn't a statement of distress. It was a simple statement of fact. "Come here," I said, my voice thick with sleep. I lifted the edge of my comforter, an open invitation. He didn't hesitate. He walked over and slid into the bed beside me, the mattress dipping with his weight. He turned onto his side to face me, and in the dim light filtering in from the street, I could see his eyes were clear and calm. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his touch feather-light. "This is better," he whispered. He settled in, his head finding its familiar place on my chest, his arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me close. There was no tension, no uncertainty. It was just a simple, profound act of coming home. I wrapped my own arms around him, holding him tight, and for the first time, we fell asleep together, not by accident or pretext, but by choice. The morning that followed was the real beginning. I woke to the smell of coffee brewing, a rich, dark scent that promised a new day. Julian was not in bed. I found him in the kitchen, barefoot, wearing an old gray sweatshirt of mine, humming softly to himself as he poured 2 mugs of coffee. He looked up when I entered, and his face broke into a genuine, unforced smile, the kind I hadn't seen in months. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. "I figured you'd want this." We stood there in the quiet kitchen, the morning light streaming through the window, sipping our coffee. The silence between us was no longer heavy with unspoken things. It was a comfortable, peaceful space, filled with a quiet understanding. It was the silence of 2 people who had finally found their way to the same room, closed the door, and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. We discovered that the strongest foundations aren't built on grand proclamations or dramatic gestures. They are laid in the quiet moments, in a shared cup of coffee in the morning light, in a hand held securely during a late-night movie, in the simple, trusting weight of a head on a shoulder. We had spent so long living within the rigid architecture of what we thought we were supposed to be, teammates, roommates, friends. But by daring to knock down a single wall, we found that what we were building was not a friendship or a romance, but simply a home, a sanctuary designed for 2, whose blueprint was drawn not with ink, but with a quiet and unwavering love.